"Sir, step aside." The voice cut through the hum of the terminal like a blade. Malik froze mid-step, his boarding pass still in hand. Around him, travelers streamed past, their conversations faltering as eyes turned his way. "What's the problem?" he asked, keeping his tone steady, though his chest tightened. The officer didn't blink. "Random check." The words dripped with the kind of certainty that left no room for challenge. Malik's fingers curled around his carry-on handle. He'd been through airports enough to know this wasn't random, not when the officer's gaze lingered on his skin before moving to his passport, not when people slowed to watch. Another guard moved into position behind him, sealing off his path. Malik's mind raced. The plane was boarding. His meeting overseas was critical. Yet here he was, being pulled out of the line as if he'd done something wrong. "I'm just trying to catch my flight," he said quietly. "You'll catch it when we're done," the officer replied. Malik's jaw clenched. This wasn't about travel security, it was about control, an unspoken reminder that in this space, his dignity was negotiable, and they held the terms. The second officer stepped closer, close enough that Malik could feel the heat of his breath. Their stance wasn't protective, it was cornering. "Empty your pockets," one ordered. "For what reason?" Malik's voice sharpened. "Just do it." The tone wasn't a request. The surrounding space seemed to shrink as their presence expanded, pushing him into a narrowing box of authority. He reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate, aware that every motion was being scrutinized. The officer's eyes tracked his hands like a hawk locking onto prey. "Where are you headed?" "London." "Business or pleasure?" "Neither feels possible right now," Malik said, his frustration bleeding through. They didn't laugh, didn't even blink. They were here for something more than protocol, and Malik was starting to realize that no answer he gave would change their intent. Malik held out his passport and ID. The officer took them without thanks, flipping through the pages as if searching for proof of a lie. "This doesn't look right," the officer muttered. Malik frowned. "That's an official U.S. passport." The second officer leaned in, scanning the document. "Could be forged. We've seen better fakes than this." A cold wave rushed through Malik's chest. "You're accusing me of carrying forged papers?" The officer shrugged, as if the idea were self-evident. "You tell us." It wasn't disbelief in his credentials. They doubted him. Doubt rooted not in evidence, but in the shade of his skin and the timbre of his voice. "Run it through your system," Malik said, his voice taut. The officer smirked. "Oh, we will." The exchange was less about verification and more about performance. Every word, every glance was part of a silent script meant to reinforce a single message: you don't belong here. The tension drew a crowd. A man in a business suit slowed to watch, his brow furrowing. A teenager lifted his phone, camera pointed directly at Malik. Somewhere, someone whispered, "What did he do?" Malik's cheeks burned, not from guilt. He'd done nothing, but from the shame of being displayed like a suspect in the middle of the concourse. The officer's voice carried louder now. "Sir, until we confirm your identity, you're not going anywhere." Heads turned, phones angled for better shots. Malik imagined the headlines already forming in strangers' minds. "Another traveler detained at airport." "Is there a problem?" a woman called out from the crowd. The officer ignored her. Malik's grip tightened around his bag. "This is harassment," he said, his words measured but sharp. "Call it what you want," the officer replied. The scene had transformed into a silent trial. No judge, no defense, only accusation by presence. Every second felt longer under the weight of collective judgment. And through it all, Malik's thoughts kept circling back to one truth. No matter how it ended, the damage was already done. The stain of suspicion clung fast, and the crowd was his jury. The officer's grip closed around Malik's arm, firm, unyielding. He could feel the ridges of the man's fingers pressing into his skin. In the background, the click of camera phones was constant, each sound another reminder that this moment was being immortalized in pixels. "Sir, calm down," the second officer said, though Malik hadn't moved. Calm down. The phrase was gasoline on a flame. His senses sharpened, the recycled airport air tasting faintly metallic, the faint overhead announcement for a flight he was missing, the fixed, expressionless faces of his accusers. Malik locked eyes with the first officer. He saw nothing there. No curiosity, no doubt. Just the cold detachment of someone confident they'd walk away justified no matter what truth surfaced. Malik's voice dropped, steady but edged with warning. Call my brother. Tell him what you're doing. The first officer's brow twitched. And who's your brother? Barack Obama. Silence cracked through the air. The officers froze, the crowd hushed, and for the first time, the balance of power shifted ever so slightly. Malik, you'll see the world one day, his mother had told him as a boy, her hands stained from tending the garden. He had believed her, not because she promised, but because she worked until her body ached to make it possible. Kisumu had been more than a hometown. It was the rhythm of early mornings by Lake Victoria, the call to prayer echoing through narrow streets, and the laughter of neighbors who knew every child by name. Years later, he would cross oceans to study economics in America, learning not just from books, but from the contradictions of a country that called itself free, yet looked at him as a question mark. Those years shaped him. Discipline from his father, compassion from his mother, and a quiet resilience he carried like a hidden shield. Malik often joked, "I'm the most Kenyan American you'll ever meet." But it wasn't a joke to him. Kenya had given him roots. America had given him wings. In one, he learned community meant survival. In the other, individuality was celebrated but often lonely. Every trip between the two felt like moving between parallel worlds, different languages, different skies, yet the same beating heart in his chest. He didn't choose one over the other. He chose both, carrying the scent of Kenyan rain and the cadence of American streets as part of the same story. "You're his brother, so you must be rich," strangers would say, their eyes lighting up with the possibilities of knowing him. Being Barack Obama's half-brother was a fact Malik never hid, but neither did he parade it. Fame wasn't his currency, dignity was. He had turned down offers to exploit the connection, choosing instead to live quietly, teaching, mentoring, and advocating for youth programs back home. It was a choice few understood, but to Malik, purpose had always outweighed luxury. A famous last name opened doors, but it was character that determined whether they stayed open. The conference invitation lay neatly folded in his jacket pocket, its words still fresh in his mind. Keynote speaker, civil rights and racial equality. This wasn't just another trip to Washington, D.C. It was a call to speak truth in a place where it mattered. Malik had seen enough injustice to know that silence helped no one. "Make it count," a friend had urged him before he left Nairobi. He planned to. His speech would weave personal stories with the broader struggle, reminding the audience that racial equality wasn't history, it was unfinished work. That morning, as he packed, he felt the weight of responsibility more than the weight of his luggage. Airports had always carried an undercurrent for him, a place where greetings and goodbyes collided, but so did suspicion. He remembered the first time an officer had held his passport too long, staring as if reading a secret between the lines. Or the woman at a ticket counter who asked if he could really afford an upgrade. These moments didn't make headlines, but they lingered, each one a small cut to dignity. He'd learned to smile, to let it pass, to choose peace over confrontation. Still, as he headed toward his gate this time, there was a flicker of unease. He didn't know why, but something in his gut told him the journey ahead would test far more than his patience. "Sir, can you remove your hat for me?" The voice was casual, but Malik could feel the presence behind him long before the words landed. He turned slightly. A TSA officer lingered 2 passengers back, eyes fixed on him. Not the line, not the conveyor belt, just him. The metal detector beeped for someone ahead, yet the officer didn't move. Instead, Malik caught the almost imperceptible hand signal to a colleague. Every step toward the scanner felt heavier. Years of traveling through airports told him this wasn't standard. This was surveillance disguised as procedure. He shifted his backpack on his shoulder, willing himself to ignore the tightening knot in his stomach. "Are you traveling for business?" the officer asked, tone polite but layered with something sharper. Malik forced a smile. Something like that. The officer's gaze didn't waver, shadowing him through the checkpoint as if waiting for an excuse. "Sir, we need you to step aside for a quick screening," another TSA worker said, gesturing toward a roped-off area. Malik had heard the line before. Random checks happen, but twice in the same terminal? That was something else. He slipped off his shoes, placing them in the gray bin. "Is there a problem?" "Just standard procedure," the agent replied without making eye contact. Behind him, a group of college students laughed their way through security, barely pausing before retrieving their bags. No one stopped them. Minutes later, Malik was waved through, only to be halted again a few steps later by a different officer. "Another random check, sir." He exhaled slowly. Funny how luck works. The officer's lips twitched, but no humor reached his eyes. As they swabbed his palms for explosives, Malik could feel other travelers glancing over, curiosity mixing with quiet judgment. The second officer handed back his boarding pass without apology, but Malik knew the label had already been stamped in their minds: suspicious. At the gate, Malik handed over his pass, relieved to finally be past security. The agent scanned it, eyes flicking from the screen to his face. Her smile was courteous, yet there was a weight behind it. "This is for first class," she said slowly, as though double-checking his comprehension. "That's correct," Malik replied evenly. "May I see your ID again?" He slid it across the counter, resisting the urge to point out the absurdity. Passengers ahead of him, mostly white, dressed far more casually, had been greeted with nothing more than a cheerful, "Enjoy your flight." She scrutinized the ID, then the ticket, before handing them back. "Just making sure everything's in order." Malik tucked his documents away. "Everything always is," he said, his voice calm but edged. The warmth in her expression didn't return. Somewhere behind him, the sound of boarding announcements faded into background noise. Malik stepped aside, observing how quickly the mood shifted when the next passengers approached. "Good afternoon. Welcome aboard," the agent beamed at a man in khakis, scanning his ticket with a flourish. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Where Malik had been met with measured skepticism, others were wrapped in effortless hospitality. It wasn't just politeness, it was comfort extended selectively, an invisible velvet rope dividing who was trusted and who was quietly questioned. He recalled similar moments, a hotel clerk asking if he was sure about his reservation, the rental car rep insisting on extra verification. The pattern was familiar, the script rehearsed. His jaw tightened, but he stepped forward toward the seating area. Every smile around him felt unearned, conditional, granted only to those who fit a certain picture. The boarding doors had not yet closed, but Malik could already feel the walls closing in. He lowered himself into a chair, letting his carry-on rest against his leg. "Breathe," he told himself, but the command was hollow. The weight in his chest had grown from a pebble to a stone. People bustled past, their chatter light, their shoulders loose. His own muscles felt locked in place. He could shrug it off, as he'd done countless times before, but every incident chipped away at something unseen. Some part of him wanted to believe this was coincidence, yet the day's sequence whispered otherwise. He adjusted his seat, trying to appear unfazed, but his pulse told a different story. From the corner of his eye, Malik saw the same TSA officer from earlier, speaking quietly into his radio. "Yeah, I'll need backup, just to be safe." The words were soft, but they carried like a shout in Malik's head. This wasn't over. It was just gathering momentum. He didn't know what the next few minutes would hold, only that the spotlight on him was burning hotter now.
"Show me your ID now." The sharp command sliced through the low airport hum, drawing every pair of eyes to Malik. Two uniformed officers loomed, their boots heavy against the polished floor. Malik froze, his boarding pass halfway to his pocket. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was steady, but a knot tightened in his stomach. "Don't make us ask again," one barked, his hand hovering near his holster. Around them, conversations halted. A man with a coffee paused mid-sip. Somewhere, a suitcase wheel squeaked before the owner stopped moving entirely. Malik's pulse quickened. He had done nothing wrong, yet the air around him felt charged, dangerous. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even. "Identification," the taller officer repeated, his voice louder this time. "And make it quick." The knot in Malik's chest pulled tighter, but he knew compliance was the only option, for now. Malik reached into his bag with deliberate slowness. "I have my documents right here," he said, pulling out a Kenyan passport, a valid U.S. visa, and an embossed invitation to the Civil Rights Leadership Conference. He held them out like an offering, hoping the official seals would end the tension. "I'm traveling for a speaking engagement in Washington, D.C." The shorter officer took the papers, flipping through them as though searching for a flaw. His lips pressed into a thin line. "These are legitimate," Malik added, meeting his gaze. The taller man leaned over his partner's shoulder, expression unreadable. "We'll see," he muttered, as if facts had no weight here. Malik forced himself to breathe evenly, though the unease was only growing stronger. The shorter officer looked up from Malik's passport, his eyes sharp with accusation. "People like you forge everything," he said flatly. "People like me?" "You heard me," the man replied, his tone dripping with disdain. "I've given you legal documents issued by two governments. If there's an issue, you can verify them." The taller officer cut him off. "Save it. We've seen your kind before. Always a different excuse." "My kind?" Malik's voice hardened. "Do you even hear yourselves?" The taller man stepped closer, invading his space. "We hear just fine, and unless you want to make this harder on yourself, I suggest you cooperate." Malik's grip tightened on the strap of his bag. He thought of the conference, of the speech he was meant to give on racial equality, and how bitterly ironic this moment was. The shorter officer smirked. "Let's find out if these so-called documents hold up under real scrutiny." Every word felt like a deliberate attempt to strip him of dignity, and it was working. A murmur spread through the nearby crowd. Some passengers pulled out their phones, recording from behind half-raised arms. Others avoided looking altogether, staring at the floor or turning away. Malik caught glimpses, wide-eyed curiosity, thinly veiled pity, and silent judgment. An elderly woman whispered to her husband. A young man shook his head slowly, as though witnessing something he'd seen too many times before. No one stepped forward. No one asked the officers to explain themselves. The taller officer glanced toward the gathering onlookers, but didn't seem concerned. If anything, he stood taller, as though feeding on the attention. Malik forced himself to stand straight, matching the man's posture. He would not shrink, not here, not now. But the truth was, every stare felt like another stone added to the weight pressing down on him. "Excuse me," a voice called from behind the officers. A white man in a tailored suit stepped forward, briefcase in hand. "I was sitting near him earlier. I heard him on a call about the conference. He's telling the truth." The taller officer didn't turn. "Sir, please step back. This doesn't concern you." "But it does," he pressed. "You're treating him like a criminal without cause." The shorter officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, we don't need commentary from bystanders." Malik met the stranger's eyes for a brief second, a flicker of gratitude, but the officers quickly moved to block the man's view. "This is routine procedure," one of them said, his tone mechanical. "Routine only for people who look like me," Malik thought bitterly. "Turn around," the taller officer ordered. Malik hesitated. Why? I've done nothing wrong. The words weren't even finished before a firm hand shoved his shoulder. The world tilted, and the next thing he knew, cold metal clamped around his wrists. The handcuffs bit into his skin as they forced him downward. Sit, the shorter officer barked. He lowered himself onto the hard tiles, his palms pressed flat against the icy floor. The hum of the terminal felt distant, muted by the pounding in his ears. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. What was that? The taller man snapped. Nothing, Malik replied, though his jaw ached from the effort of holding back. From his position on the ground, the view was a sea of legs and luggage. He caught snippets of hushed voices, judgment, disbelief, curiosity, all circling him like a storm. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was intentional. Somewhere to Malik's left, a small voice rose above the murmurs. "Mama, why are they taking the bad man away?" The words hit harder than the cold cuffs. Malik turned his head just enough to see a little boy holding his mother's hand, his wide eyes fixed on him. The mother pulled his son close, whispering something Malik couldn't hear. But the damage was done. In that instant, he wasn't a respected speaker, a community leader, or the brother of a former president. He was just the bad man in the eyes of an innocent child. Because that's what the uniforms and the handcuffs made him look like. The weight of that perception settled deep in his chest. Malik's fingers curled into fists against the floor, the cuffs clinking softly. Anger surged, hot and unrelenting, but there was nowhere for it to go. He wanted to shout, to demand they admit this was wrong, but every instinct told him that pushing back would only feed their power. He stared straight ahead, his breathing measured, even as his thoughts screamed. Every muscle in his body ached to rise, yet the steel on his wrists was a reminder. Right now, he was trapped. And the worst part was knowing this wasn't over.
Malik? The voice was hesitant, yet certain. He turned, and there she was, a young black woman in a press badge lanyard, eyes locked on his restrained hands. Her face shifted from recognition to outrage in seconds. "I know who you are," she said under her breath, stepping closer despite the officer's glare. "And I know what this is." The lead officer barked, "Step back, ma'am. This is none of your concern." Her jaw tightened. "It's absolutely my concern when Barack Obama's brother is being treated like a criminal at an airport." Malik felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just another passerby. She was a witness who understood the weight of what was happening. He met her gaze. "Don't let them bury this," he whispered. She gave a single nod. "They won't." And just like that, her hand reached for her phone. "Live from Washington Dulles International Airport," she began, voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "This is what racial profiling looks like in real time." The camera framed Malik, still in handcuffs, flanked by two stone-faced officers. For those tuning in, the man you're seeing is Malik Obama. Yes, the brother of former President Barack Obama, being detained without clear explanation. One officer stepped forward, blocking the shot. "Turn that off now." She didn't even blink. "We are live to thousands of viewers. This video is being mirrored on multiple accounts. Any attempt to stop me will only make this worse." Malik could hear the faint pinging of notifications from her phone. Likes, shares, comments flooding in. A voice from the livestream chat shouted through her earbuds, "We're with you, Malik." He took a slow breath. For the first time since the ordeal began, the balance of power felt as if it were shifting. The world was watching, and the officers knew it. By the time Malik heard the first officer's radio crackle, the internet had already decided. Hashtag Justice for Malik and hashtag Flying While Black were trending on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. "People are furious," the journalist murmured, scrolling through the feed. "They're tagging news stations, senators, even the White House." Malik could hear snippets from bystanders reading tweets aloud. "It's everywhere," someone said. The lead officer's expression had shifted from smug certainty to visible unease. He adjusted his stance, as though suddenly aware that every movement, every word was being immortalized online. Another comment flashed on the journalist's screen. "This is modern-day racism in full view." Malik thought about the hundreds of similar stories that had never been caught on camera. This time, though, there was no erasing it, no misunderstanding to hide behind. And with each passing minute, the crowd and the outrage grew louder. It started with a single ringing phone at the TSA podium, then another. Soon, a chorus of urgent calls filled the terminal office. Civil Rights Coalition on line 3, Washington Post on 2. Reverend Carter wants a statement now. Malik listened as an officer muttered into his radio, "We're getting swamped here. People are saying this is on every major outlet." The journalist's phone buzzed nonstop. "You've got ministers, celebrities, and half of D.C. calling for your release," she whispered. The officers exchanged glances, their authority eroding under the pressure. What began as an attempt to quietly intimidate had morphed into a public relations wildfire they could no longer control. Every unanswered call, every refusal to comment was making the story burn hotter. The first sign of trouble came in the form of hurried footsteps. A senior TSA manager, red-faced and visibly rattled, pushed through the circle of onlookers. "What's going on here?" he demanded, though his eyes darted nervously toward the journalist's phone. The lead officer began. "Sir, this man—" "I know who he is," the manager interrupted sharply. He leaned in, speaking in a low voice that was still caught by the live stream mic. "Do you realize who's watching this? Do you want your badge on CNN tonight?" The officers stiffened. Malik could see the cracks forming in their composure. The manager's gaze shifted to Malik. "We're going to clear this up." It was less an assurance and more of a surrender. The click of the cuffs unlocking echoed louder than Malik expected. "There," the officer muttered, avoiding his eyes. "You're free to go." Free? The word felt hollow. His wrists burned, his pride bruised. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd mixed with the relentless pings of breaking news alerts. The journalist kept her camera up, capturing every second. "Malik, any statement for those watching?" He hesitated. "This isn't just about me. This is about every black traveler who's been treated as a threat before they're seen as a human being." The manager cleared his throat. "Sir, we'd like to move you somewhere private." But Malik didn't move. He knew the story was no longer his to hide. It belonged to the thousands demanding answers, and they weren't letting go anytime soon.
On behalf of the airport authority, we deeply regret the misunderstanding, the spokesperson read from a prepared statement, her voice flat, her eyes avoiding the cameras. Malik stood nearby, hands clasped, hearing every hollow syllable bounce around the terminal. They called it a misunderstanding. He called it humiliation. Reporters pressed him for a reaction, but he only said, "An apology without change is just noise." Flashbulbs popped, but Malik knew this moment wasn't the end. The country was watching now, and he intended to make sure no one could sweep it under a rug. The following afternoon, Malik stepped onto the podium at the Civil Rights Conference, applause rising like a wave. "Yesterday, I was not a guest in this country. I was a suspect," he began, his voice steady yet weighted. He spoke of the cold handcuffs, the suspicious glares, the child's voice calling him the bad man. "Systemic racism isn't an abstract theory, it's a lived reality. I lived it in that airport." Every sentence landed heavy, pulling the audience into his truth.
Some nodded with tears in their eyes. Others clenched their fists in silent rage. This is why we gather, because injustice only thrives when silence keeps it comfortable. By evening, Malik's words were playing on every major network. Clips flooded social media, sparking conversations from coffee shops to Congress. Civil rights leaders demanded reform. Lawmakers called for hearings, and a federal investigation into airport security practices was launched. Airports across the country faced pressure to retrain officers and review profiling policies. For Malik, this was more than personal vindication. It was a crack in the wall of complacency. The system was shifting, if only slightly, and the weight of his humiliation had turned into a catalyst for nationwide scrutiny. He closed his speech with words that would echo far beyond the conference hall. You shouldn't have to be Barack Obama's brother to be treated with dignity. The room erupted, not in celebration, but in a collective vow. Malik stepped down from the stage, knowing the fight was far from over. He had no illusions about the road ahead, but he also knew this: the silence had been broken. And once truth is spoken into the world, it cannot be unheard. You've heard my story, Malik's voice cuts in, direct and unflinching. But now, I want to hear yours. Have you ever been profiled, stopped, or humiliated just for existing? Think about it, because change starts when we admit it exists. Share your experience in the comments. Every voice matters. Every truth adds weight. When we speak, we create a record they can't erase, and that's how movements begin. If this story moved you, like and subscribe. Not for me, for the next person who needs to know they're not alone. Together, our reach becomes impossible to ignore.